I'm Stuart Varney.
I'm Martha McCallum.
I'm Jason Chaffetz, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, March 8th, 2023. I'm Dave Anthony. Did COVID leak out of a Chinese lab? House Republicans probing that hold their first hearing today. We talked to a Democrat who's also part of that investigation.
It's more important than ever that the issue remain evidence-based and free from politicization, partisanship, and conspiracy.
I'm Jessica Rosenthal. 2 Americans were killed and 2 others are back on U.S. soil after they were kidnapped in Mexico. The international incident is raising questions about our cooperation with Mexico as officials blame the deaths on drug cartels.
Different criminal groups are trying to make inroads in each other's territories because these are very profitable drug smuggling and now human smuggling routes. So, a lot of times Americans are simply caught in the crossfire.
And I'm Joe Concha. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
It's been almost 3 years to the day since the World Health Organization declared COVID a pandemic, and we still don't know where it came from.
The plausible explanation seems to be from the lab, and I think more and more people are seeing that.
A lab leak theory the FBI and Energy Department recently determined is likely. Republican Congressman Brad Wenstrup tells Fox.
I sit on Intelligence Committee, so I've been gathering a lot of this evidence over the last few years that does have the breadcrumbs leading towards the lab. That's my opinion at this time, but we want to be able to get to the facts.
And today, the subcommittee Wenstrup chairs, investigating COVID's origins, holds its first hearing. And they might put some focus on Dr. Anthony Fauci, who back in 2020, as a Trump COVID advisor, shot that theory down.
There was a study recently that we can make available to you where a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists looked at the sequences there. Where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
Well, House Republicans have since released emails from then they say show Fauci prompted that research, and then it was sent to him for final approval before it was released in the journal Nature in February 2020. Now, Fauci denies he was involved in that paper, but after making it public, Congressman Wenstrup says
he gets a thank you from Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance, who does coronavirus research in the Wuhan lab, saying thank you for saying that.
Well, a Democrat who was on this COVID origins committee hopes they can get beyond the politics.
It depends how the work of this committee is conducted and where we go.
Congresswoman Debbie Dingell is a Democrat from Michigan.
I think we need to learn from what happened during this pandemic on COVID. Are we prepared as a nation if another one hits? What do we do to have to strengthen our preparedness and our resiliency? And I think a lot of people would like to see this, but I fear that this could become politicized, partisanized. So what I hope we'll do as we're looking at these issues is examine the question that's crossed the minds of millions of Americans over the past 3 years. How did this COVID-19 pandemic begin? But I think it's very, very important that we do facts and not conspiracy theories. I'm taking this really seriously, and I do think we need to understand the root cause of the pandemic that has taken a significant toll on all of us.
We've had mixed messages on the origins of COVID, and not long ago there was the Energy Department assessment, then the one from the FBI that it was very likely that there was a leak from a Chinese lab, and then the Biden administration said there's no consensus in the intelligence community on this. A lot of Republicans come into this investigation believing that lab leak theory. Where are you on that?
You know, I want to divide this into 2 questions. I've spent all weekend just digging into all of the scientific journals, looking at all the articles, people pointing fingers at each other. I think one question is this a man-made virus? And I actually think, and I'm not a scientist, that a lot of the leading scientists believe, given the DNA, the genetics of it, that it was not man-made, but there are people that are pointing fingers and even asking on that. The second question was, and at the roundtable discussion we had last week with some of the doctors who some think controversial, they themselves said they do believe that this was probably a leak, but they don't believe it was a virus that was being developed or used to weaponize, but maybe to find a vaccine, etc. I've always wondered if it could have potentially escaped from the lab. Other people feel there's very strong documentation that it started at the Wuhan animal and fish market. I'm going to continue to listen to experts. I have to tell you, if I was to really be honest, I think I read about 40 articles this weekend, and it's hard to discern. There's a lot of contradicting information out there.
It is difficult because China is not being forthcoming on this. There was a World Health Organization investigation that said that, well, it's not plausible that there was a lab leak. But then people said, well, they weren't even allowed in. They weren't given very much information. And then people were critical that the WHO was just pretty much giving China cover. Do you think that investigation that was done properly or not?
I think China did not allow the proper investigation to be done. And I think because of that, we probably will always have people disagreeing or not knowing what really happened. But I really do want to say that the scientists, the doctors, the researchers, the intelligence community, now people like us and other experts work to understand the origins of this pandemic, because we don't want one to happen again. And if it does, how are we going to be prepared? It's more important than ever that the issue remain evidence-based and free from politicization, partisanship, and conspiracy. That's what I'm really focused on and I'm going to ask any question. I'm open to everything. I'm with somebody that was very afraid of the vaccines. Down the road, we're going to get into more vaccine questions. I know that I got Guyon's Bray from swine flu shot when I was just out of college and was paralyzed for a while. So I know bad things happen, but I also know that we've almost eliminated measles. We don't have polio. We don't have horrific diseases in our communities because of these. So we need to understand them.
You talk about how you don't want it to be politicized, but obviously at some point there is going to be an attempt to get Dr. Anthony Fauci to testify. Republicans have put out these emails that they say raise questions about how maybe he was involved in trying to get a group of scientists to discredit any lab leak theory in February of 2020, before the pandemic was even declared, as a way to stop people from going down that road. The Democrats on the committee, do you not want him to testify? Do you fear going down that road?
I am going into all of this open-minded. But what I do want to say is that we're already on a dangerous path of extremism. And now's the time to fix that, not add fuel to the fire. The spread of misinformation throughout this pandemic has really, and this is a very serious problem. This is a public health problem. The decline in people's confidence in the public trust in our nation's scientists and experts. There's a Pew Research survey from last year that says that only 29% of American adults have a great deal of confidence in our scientists, in our medical scientists. That's scary. It's not just COVID and those kinds of vaccinations that we're talking about now. We have kids not getting their measles vaccines, and we're seeing outbreaks of measles in communities. They're not the flu shots and more. We need to try to be calm. We need to try to get the facts. We need to educate people.
People on the right have blamed scientists like Dr. Fauci for some of the mistrust, because some of the things they advocated turned out to not be totally accurate, or that we learn new information about COVID over time. So do you think that the way the vaccine emerged, where we thought it would be herd immunity, and that didn't work out that way. Do you think that's part of the reason people aren't sure about science?
Well, first of all, I want to remind people that this vaccine started under President Trump.
Sure.
And a lot of people have what we don't know, and thankfully I don't want to know, is without this vaccine, how many more people would have died. And I think that the goal of our committee needs to be that we remain committed to science, put the needs of American people front and center. Let's not do political theater. And I really want to work with my colleagues that we will pursue responsible oversight over the nation's pandemic response to make sure we're better prepared for the next public health crisis. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to take 100 years. I think we could be, what I'm hearing and what I'm studying and I'm reading, it could be sooner than any of us would like. So I think we got to really work hard to put people over politics, to use a phrase I do a lot, and protect our nation's health, understand it, and be ready. We do need to understand what happened, but let's not do it in a theatrical way. And we need to understand it so we're ready for the future.
China calls the lab leak theory a political smear. Add that to the U.S. scrutiny of TikTok, the spy balloon, and the U.S. support of Taiwan, and you get a threat from the Chinese foreign minister that the U.S. is risking conflict and confrontation.
Viewing China as a primary rival is like putting the first button of your shirt in the wrong hole. The United States must stop trying to contain and suppress China.
But Congresswoman Dingell says that should not stop us from probing how COVID started in China.
I think we need answers. I think we do need to understand what did or did not happen at the Wuhan lab, what did happen at that animal market. And I think that that's a critical factor for global health, for world health. I am worried about our Chinese relations right now, but we cannot be threatened by them. I think we got to work with them through diplomacy. But I'll be very candid. The United States is too dependent upon China, period. And we've got to bring, one of the things COVID did teach us is we need to bring our supply chain home. We should not be dependent on China for masks and gloves and gowns. And, we're bringing our chip production back home. It hurt my auto industry in Michigan very badly. And people do not realize that 80 to 90% of our pharmaceuticals, the generic pharmaceuticals, are made in China. And that's a national security issue for our country.
How do we bring it all back, though?
We got to be intentional. We got the chips bill through. I'm talking to my Republican colleagues on energy and commerce. And what are we going to do to bring it home? And we're all talking about it.
Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, a Democrat from Michigan, member of the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was good to be with you.
This is Joe Concha with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
2 Americans have been brought back to the U.S. after they were kidnapped in Matamoros, Mexico. 2 others they were with were killed. And State Department spokesman Ned Price said their bodies were recovered.
In terms of justice and accountability, this is something that will be within the purview of our law enforcement colleagues. Of course, the FBI is engaged on this. Mexican authorities are engaged on this. It's not for me or for the State Department to be prescriptive, but ultimately we want to see accountability.
Family members of the 4 say the group was headed to Mexico as one of them was going to receive a medical procedure and that they were from North and South Carolina. Mexico's president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, said those responsible will be found and punished. The governor of the state of Tamaulipas said they think the kidnapping was based on mistaken identity. Video of the abduction showed armed men walking one of the Americans from a white minivan to the bed of a pickup truck. The other 3 were dragged in after 2 cars had collided and armed men surrounded the scene. This area of Mexico is dominated by the Gulf Cartel primarily, and even in the early stages of the investigation, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland said the cartels are responsible here. At the White House, spokeswoman Karine Jean-Pierre said,
in the past few months, President Biden signed an executive order giving the Department of Treasury expanded authorities to penalize cartel organizations and those who control or enable them. and we have imposed powerful new sanctions against cartel organizations.
Last week, at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham asked Garland if he'd oppose labeling cartels as terrorist organizations.
I wouldn't oppose it, but again, I want to point out there are diplomatic concerns. We need the assistance of Mexico in this and designating.
Is Mexico helping us effectively with our fentanyl?
They are helping us, but they could do much more. There's no question about that.
Well, if this is helping, I would hate to see what not helping looks like.
Well before this kidnapping, Republicans had argued the president's border policies had empowered cartels. And well before this kidnapping, the State Department had issued travel advisories, warning of heightened crime and an increased risk of kidnapping in parts of Mexico, including the state of Tamaulipas.
Be very careful about traveling in Mexico. There are many parts of that country where security is very iffy.
Chris Landau was the U.S. ambassador to Mexico in the last 2 years of the Trump administration.
And if you're planning a trip to Mexico, I'd encourage you to look at the U.S. State Department website, state.travel.gov, and check the warnings by the U.S. government. You know, many more Americans go to Mexico than any other foreign country on earth by a factor of, I don't know, like at least 5 or 6 times. I think more than 30 million Americans visit Mexico in an average year. And, you know, things do happen. Mexico is the only country in the world where the State Department actually provides travel warnings at a subnational level. You know, every other country, it's just the entire country. Mexico, obviously different parts of the country have very different security situations, just like parts of our country. And I think there are 6 states in Mexico where the United States government recommends that Americans do not go, at least in part. And unfortunately, the Matamoros area is one of those areas.
This violence and the State Department warnings and, of course, what's happened in this incident with these 4 Americans, it, of course, brings to mind violence in certain parts of Mexico and the cartel-related violence in specific. And I just want your thoughts, because we know cartels morph and change depending on arrests and who becomes, you know, the leader. We know Sinaloa is the big one right now. That was the one El Chapo ran. His 3 sons, including Ovidio Guzman, became the top players. But I guess violence increased after Ovidio was arrested in January. And then there's this offshoot of Sinaloa, right? The CNJC, the New Generation Jalisco Cartel. Are these the 2 main ones we should be talking about? Is their rivalry adding to violence right now?
Yeah, I mean, typically the violence in Mexico flares up in areas of the country where different criminal organizations are vying for supremacy. And, you know, that is apparently the case nowadays in this Matamoros area. I was just reading about this. A few years ago, that was not the case in Matamoros. There was basically one criminal organization at that time that had control there. But as you can imagine, this is a pretty dynamic situation, and different criminal groups are trying to make inroads in each other's territories because these are very profitable drug smuggling and now human smuggling routes. So, you know, a lot of times Americans are simply caught in the crossfire. Remember a few years ago when I was ambassador, actually, they killed a Mormon dual national family up in the mountains between Chihuahua and Sonora state. And that apparently was a case of mistaken identity. That, you know, the Americans in this van were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the bad guys, they just, they saw a white car. They were looking for a white car and they fired on the wrong white car. So I think particularly people who are kind of traveling, you know, in Mexico in a car should just be very careful. I mean, we had problems sometimes that our agricultural inspectors would get attacked, and sometimes it was a case of mistaken identity. So again, I think, you know, particularly in some of these areas where there's a decent amount of organized criminal activity, it is a dangerous country.
Yeah, the Tamaulipas Attorney General has said that they're operating off a narrative that they believe this was possibly mistaken identity. It's still early, of course. But I want to ask you, we've heard from lawmakers, namely Republicans, I think former President Trump talked about this as well, about naming cartels terrorist organizations. And I know our Attorney General, Merrick Garland, was asked about this last week before Senate Judiciary, and he said, you know, he didn't necessarily disagree with naming them as cartels, but he said, you want to be careful. We've got diplomatic issues. We want Mexico's cooperation. How tricky is this if we were to make such a designation and call the cartels terrorist organizations? Does that rock the boat, or would you expect Mexico to be like, okay, yeah, call them that and then come help us?
Look, when I was ambassador, this issue was very much on our radar screen. And I asked the question, well, what do we gain from declaring the cartels terrorist organizations? And I didn't receive a particularly satisfactory answer that we really gained any kind of authority that we didn't already have under existing law. So, I get the sense that there's a push to do this to make people feel like we're doing something. And I understand that impulse, but I think you got to be really careful when you do something that you don't make a situation worse. And I am generally pretty skeptical of the U.S. deciding that a military answer is the answer to problems in the rest of the world, of which there is absolutely no lack. I mean, it seems to me as a country, if you unilaterally send American military forces into another country, that's going to have profound repercussions, in that country, needless to say, and on that country's willingness to cooperate with our government on a whole range of issues.
I want your take, though, on the level of cooperation. Like when you were ambassador and you were under a different administration, obviously, with different goals. What is the level of cooperation with Mexico? How do you perceive it to be? I mean, Lindsey Graham said at the Senate Judiciary last week that if this is cooperation, what we're getting right now, then this isn't so great. I guess, where does this go from here then? Does Mexico need to step up and say something here?
Look, I think we cooperate with Mexico on a whole range of issues. I mean, these security issues are not the only issues, needless to say, on the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I can certainly think of another one that's kind of high on the agenda, which is migration, right? And if Mexico says, well, forget about the U.S., we are not going to cooperate in any way, shape, or form on migration issues, let me tell you, that border situation can get a heck of a lot worse. So, again, I am not particularly happy about the level of Mexican cooperation on security issues and their own commitment to rooting out organized crime in their own country. But I'm not sure that the U.S. undertaking law enforcement efforts in Mexico is a particularly happy outcome for either the U.S. or Mexico. I mean, this is a country of 130 million people. If you stretch it out across the map of the U.S., we go all the way from western Montana to the coast of South Carolina. Are we really going to want to get involved in policing that and make that our responsibility? And if so, again, Jessica, it sounds great to say, oh yeah, we're going to send the good guys down there. We're going to catch the bad guys and bring them to justice. Okay, but how do you define victory? I mean, how many times over the years has the U.S. gotten involved in, peacekeeping or law enforcement in another country without an exit strategy? This migration crisis that Biden has unleashed is huge business for the cartels. And, I think, frankly, before we're starting to talk about military operations within the sovereign territory of Mexico, we should be talking about fixing up our own policies, which would allow a regime of law and order to prevail at the border, which it currently does not. They're starting to talk tough. It is their policies of having undone Trump's policies that created this mess in the first place.
It sounds like then when the New York Times is reporting that this administration is preparing an end to Title 42 by maybe detaining families, migrant families who come, even if it's a family unit, and even if that means that, the child can't be detained, longer than 20 days. This was also a policy that was implemented by the Trump administration. Are you surprised to hear the Biden administration considering that, or talk that they're considering that?
Well, look, I we'll see when it happens. I mean, I am not convinced. I mean, these are the same people who undid everything like that gleefully 2 years ago and unleashed this crisis. So, I don't put any stock into them actually trying to fix this. I mean, they claim in a lot of ways that they, are fixing the problem and that, that they're reducing illegal migration. Well, one of the ways they're doing that is by preemptively granting people parole, basically giving them a free ticket to enter the United States, giving them like preemptive parole so that they can say, well, there's a humanitarian parole measure for people who are otherwise are subject to deportation from the United States, the upshot of which is to incentivize this kind of migration. I mean, again, as ambassador, I witnessed this with my own eyes, that there's no shortage of people in Central America and Mexico and around the world who would like to come to the United States. Okay. But again, they're economically rational. They're not going to, put their lives on the line and their fortunes if they have a very low probability of doing that. So a lot of what is driving this are the policies which drastically affect their probability of getting across Mexico and getting into the United States and remaining here if they make it across the border. So to the extent the United States is having asylum policies that encourage people to file bogus asylum claims that may take years to be adjudicated, in which time they can kind of put down roots in this country, or, announce that they're not going to do any internal deportations, or that if you come with a kid, that's a get out of jail free card. I mean, that basically, those kind of policies, they sound great on paper. What they do is they kind of incentivize people to drag children on this very dangerous journey as kind of a get out of jail free card. I mean, the level of perverse incentives is just mind-boggling.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Chris Landau, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And in other news,
I'm Gianna Gelosi. American Girl revealed its latest historical dolls, and if you're a millennial like me, prepare to feel old. 90s and Y2K nostalgia is all the rage right now, and American Girl is getting in on the trend with two new historical dolls, fraternal twins Isabel and Nikki Hoffman. The Hoffman sisters' stories are set in Seattle during the historical year of 1999. Their accessories include a desktop computer, a purple inflatable chair, and a Tamagotchi. Remember those? Isabel is described as a bubbly, extroverted girl into pop music, while Nikki is introverted and into skateboarding. Until the release of Nikki and Isabel, the most recent historical doll was Courtney Moore, whose story takes place in 1986. Twitter users were both astounded that the 90s are now considered historical and impressed by the brand's spot-on accessories. The official American Girl Twitter account even acknowledged all of this so-called uproar with a tweet apologizing for the release, saying, quote, "We didn't mean to hurt so many feelings today." The twins are also American Girl's first ever twin characters, and they're now available for purchase. For the Fox News Rundown, I'm Gianna Gelosi.
I'm Emily Campagno, and this is the Fox True Crime Podcast, bringing you closer to the story than you ever thought possible. Subscribe at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts. These are the stories that keep you up at night.
Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Joe Concha.
What's on your mind?
Way back when in the 80s, the one thing that President Ronald Reagan and House Speaker Tip O'Neill deplored more than each other's political philosophy was this thing called stalemate. And for the country to be so polarized by ideology and party politics that it couldn't move forward. Instead, these two leaders had a stronger commitment to this thing called getting things done. O'Neill and Reagan were both of Irish descent, and when disagreement got heated between the two parties, the two men would often meet in a sign of respect with an eye towards civility after work in the Oval Office over a nice cocktail. The result? The former actor and California governor won 49 states in the 1984 presidential election. 4 years later, Reagan would leave office with an approval rating of 63%, the highest of any Republican president in Gallup's history to this day. I guess people like compromise, huh? But fast forward to 2023 and try to imagine, in an age of cable news and toxic social media, leaders of each party working together on important issues like, securing the U.S. border or improving our slumping educational standards for our kids. And then try to imagine Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Biden having an adult beverage privately after work to see where compromise could be found. And now think of the kind of vitriol these kinds of actions would foment. Make no mistake, it would be portrayed as weakness, with McCarthy being called an establishment rhino, that's a Republican in name only, and Biden being accused of aiding and abetting extreme, ultra, mega, MAGA insurrectionists at a time when democracy itself is in peril. So it makes one wonder how Ronald Reagan would do if he was sent through time and placed into the running for the 2024 nomination. Would he be called a rhino by former President Trump for daring to work with the other side? Absolutely. Would Reagan win the GOP nomination today as a result? That's a rhetorical question, everyone. But for those who don't know, the answer is no. I'm Joe Concha.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. And now, stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. Listen ad-free on Fox News Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts. And Prime members can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Hey, it's Will Kane, co-host of Fox and Friends Weekend. Join me as I share my thoughts on a wide range of topics, from sports and pop culture to politics and business.
The Will Kane Podcast. Subscribe and listen now at foxnewspodcasts.com or wherever you get your podcasts.